Hi everybody, it's Kari and Allison. We're at the Racine Heritage Museum, and today we are continuing our series on the Underground Railroad. We will be discussing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So Allison's going to begin with a little bit of background information about that.
So there were actually two increments of the Fugitive Slave Act. It started in 1793 when it was initially enacted. And that was just a requirement that freedom-seeking slaves that had escaped to the north had to be returned to their slaveholders in the south. Ultimately, though, this was unenforceable. This was a rule made by the federal government, and at the time, the federal government did not have a whole lot of method of enforcing laws at the state level. So they were kind of relying on the states to enforce these laws for them, and unfortunately for them, the northern states did not agree with the law, so they're just like, we're just not going to do it, pretty much. Many states, in fact, ended up, in reaction to it, passing personal liberty laws for escaped slaves, saying, you know, these people have a right to a trial by jury before they can be sent back south. You can't just come and take them. Ultimately, in 1850, defiance of that law led to the reenactment of it. So in 1850, after the Mexican-American War, the country has just acquired a whole lot of new territory, and the non-slaveholding states and the slaveholding states were kind of at war as to whether or not these new territories were going to allow slavery. So as part of a compromise, a series of bills with that compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act was reenacted, and this time it was more strict. There were actual penalties involved with not complying with the law. People could be jailed or fined if they were actively helping freedom seekers, or if they were just not turning them in. So ultimately this led up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court declaring in 1855 that it was unconstitutional. We will be covering that whole process in our next segment, talking about Joshua Glover. And it's a really big story, guys. So 1855, the Wisconsin Supreme Court is the only state-level court to declare the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional. Ultimately, that was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1859. So we fast forward a little bit to the beginning of the Civil War. In 1861, in defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act, the Confiscation Act was put into play, where basically, in order for the Union Army to get a little bit of an edge over the Confederates, they declared that once a slave had escaped slavery, they could not be re-enslaved. So that was kind of to bolster the Union Army, because many of those escaped slaves would then go and fight for the Union Army. And then the Act was not formally repealed until 1864. Ultimately, the point of the Act was to kind of help reinforce slavery and keep it going, but really what it only did was to really light a fire under the abolitionist movement, especially in Wisconsin. And Kari's going to talk to you a little bit more about that. So take it away, Kari.
Yeah, so we wanted to discuss this today because next week when we talk about Joshua Glover, this is really a huge catalyst and a huge part of the Joshua Glover story. So as far as in Racine, the biggest point of application of the Fugitive Slave Act was the Joshua Glover story. And since we're going to talk about that next week, I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot, but another interesting story that relates to the Fugitive Slave Act is the Lady Elgin story. So around the same time in 1860, when tensions were really rising over the Fugitive Slave Act, the governor of Wisconsin, Alexander Randall, was beginning to talk about Wisconsin actually seceding from the Union over this. Because Wisconsin felt so strongly against this federal law. And so they began to survey some of the local militias and ask them if they would be willing to take up arms against federal troops for Wisconsin to actually leave the Union. One of these militia leaders, Garrett Berry, was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was against slavery and he was against the Fugitive Slave Act, but he considered taking up arms against the Union to be an act of treason. And so he said that he would not do that. So around that time, the state adjutant general, who is like the attorney general, he removed the charter of all of the militias, and I'm not sure why. I wasn't able to find information about that, but they revoked the commission of the militias and disarmed a lot of these small militias, which just furthered tensions and anger over people's rights. And so at that point, the Union Guard, who Garrett Berry was the leader of, they refused to disband, and they decided that they were going to raise funds to get the weapons that they needed, and they were not going to disband. And so in order to do that, they had a fundraiser where they actually sold tickets for people to board the Lady Elgin, which was a luxury steamship. It was a paddle wheel boat that would cruise up and down the shore of Lake Michigan between Milwaukee, Chicago, and there was a Democratic political rally with speeches and parades for presidential candidate Stephen A. Douglas that was going to be happening in Chicago. And so they made a whole event of it. People bought tickets, they were going to spend the night, they were going to go down to Chicago and then cruise back. And there was a band and dinner and dancing and everything. So they sold out this ship, went down to Chicago, had the event. That night, people were getting on and off the boat. They weren't really regulating who was getting on and who was getting off, so they don't know for sure who was on. There were 385 actual ticketed passengers on a manifest. However, around 11 o'clock, a storm was coming, and the captain of the ship was very nervous about the weather and decided to just go ahead and take off. When he took off, they're not sure exactly how many people were on the boat. It could have been upwards of 600 people. They really have no idea. And so the boat took off, and they were about 16 miles north of Chicago, near Winnetka, Illinois. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and a schooner named the Augusta was coming and was way overloaded and very poorly managed. There was a new captain of this boat who wasn't very familiar with it, didn't understand how the boat would behave in high seas and as loaded as it was. And so the Augusta actually rammed right into the Lady Elgin and actually hit it sort of on the side, so it sheared the paddle wheel off and just made a giant hole right in the Lady Elgin. Now, the Lady Elgin was 4 times the size of the Augusta, so the sailors on the Augusta really thought that their boat probably had to sustain the most damage. Also, it was dark, it was windy, it was stormy, nobody could hear one another. They think that the storm actually just carried the Augusta away, but by all accounts, the Augusta hit and run the Lady Elgin and made a hole and took off. Which caused a lot of controversy later, which I'll get to. So the Lady Elgin was hit and started taking on water very rapidly. It split the hull. The Lady Elgin started to turn and actually roll over, and the entire ship sank within 30 minutes, which is pretty fast. So they really didn't have time to grab lifeboats. They were able to use 2 of the lifeboats. Many of the lifeboats didn't have oars. Because of the split in the hull, passengers were separated from life jackets and a lot of the lifeboats, and so it was just pandemonium. And the captain obviously was concerned, but he knew that they were close to shore, and so he told people to just grab onto pieces of wreckage or whatever they could and float to shore. It was a good idea. However, sadly enough, many people made it all the way to shore or almost to shore, only to be killed by the pounding surf and the rocks and the waves. And so, as I said, the official passenger list was 385, but they think between 400 and 500 people actually perished in that shipwreck. And it was a big confusion over who, because again, there were people on the boat that were not ticketed passengers, and so it was difficult to determine who was actually on the boat in that time. But it is known as the greatest maritime disaster loss of life on the Great Lakes, just because of the sheer number of people that passed away in that shipwreck. And so another reason that it's very compelling is because the fact that it was a political excursion to raise money for a political cause, all kinds of conspiracy theories surfaced right after the shipwreck because of the fact that the Augusta came and hit it and took off. People were saying that the Augusta was commissioned to do this, and you know, it was just a big investigation. But of course they found out that that wasn't true. It truly was just an accident, and the people on the Augusta had no intention of doing any such thing. But it very much fueled animosity towards people who were in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act, which in Wisconsin there were not a lot of, but it definitely fueled the rhetoric against it. Interesting side note, years later, and then there was a trial and an investigation over the crew of the Augusta, but the owners of the Augusta painted it black and changed its name, hoping to continue to use it. And it did come into port in Milwaukee, and people recognized it even though it had been painted and its name changed, and it had to leave very quickly because an angry mob of people were going to set fire to it, because so many people passed away in that shipwreck that there was no family that wasn't touched in some way, shape, or form by that tragedy. So just a really tumultuous time leading up to the Civil War, and really just touched off by the Joshua Glover incident, which we're going to talk about next week. So we really appreciate you listening to these and learning with us, and we will see you again in a week.
Bye.
Bye.